Greetings. Formation of identity by age 18. Identity is a very personal thing. Each person has a distinct identity. Identity helps us understand our role in the society. It helps us understand our personality. And it is the thing that we define ourselves by. So, how is identity formed? Erik Erikson, a renowned psychologist, suggested that identity is formed by the age of 18 after the individual has gone through a period of identity crisis during their adolescence, or also known as the teenage. So the objectives for the project are to acknowledge Erik Erikson's theory, complement Erik Erikson's theory, to agree that identity crisis does occur during the adolescence and that an identity does begin to form as one approaches adulthood. However, I do not believe that's where it stops. I believe identity is formed throughout our lives because there are so many changes in the situation which change our identity through time, which is the main objective for the project. First source is identity crisis among adolescent of third secondary students. This was a study conducted among 370 male Yemeni students. And the aim of the study was to prove or disprove Erik Erikson's theory. It was done through questionnaire method, and it managed to prove Erik Erikson's theory right because the results showed a low level of identity crisis, which could imply that the identity crisis was getting resolved or an identity was being formed. However, it must be taken into consideration that this study was conducted among Yemeni men who come from Yemeni families which have very strong cultural views, which may have had an effect on the result. What I'm trying to imply when mentioning the statement is, if this test was taken at any other part of the world, the result would have probably been slightly different. However, we will still consider this as a relevant example in favor of Erik Erikson's theory. On the right is an image of Yemeni men showing their cultural heritage at Cultural Day in the universities. And on the left is an image, or it's a still from a high school movie, or even if you take the example of a high school TV show, in the start of the show, the characters usually start with a lot of role confusion and identity crisis. However, as they progress towards the graduation day, they become mature and resolve their identity crisis, just exactly how Erik Erikson suggested it. As they turn 18, the crisis gets resolved. The second source is the impact of identity crisis on the judgment of late adolescent men. This is a very interesting study because it, in a way, agrees to Erik Erikson's theory, and in a way, it doesn't. The way it agrees to Erik Erikson's theory is that there is identity crisis that peaks during adolescence, and there is the basis of formation of identity that occurs as we approach adulthood. However, that's not the only outcome of the process. Other outcomes of the process can be identity diffusion, negative identity, and moratorium. Why does this occur? This occurs because we fail to understand that there is a relation between the resolution of identity and the degree of adjustment. If you resolve an identity crisis and form an identity, but are not able to adjust to the change, then it will not be a permanent resolution, but will be a temporary regression of the identity crisis, which will eventually lead to crisis in adulthood. A study was conducted using a sample of 73 men about the average age of 21. And the study showed the highest scores at the HYPT index test, on the HYPT index to be those of identity achievers and identity diffusion. which proves that along with identity achievers, there are equal amount of identity diffusion subjects who enter into adulthood, which will cause resurgence of identity crisis in adulthood. Which brings us to our third source, resurgence of identity crisis in adulthood. This study, or thesis to be particular, focuses on the fact that people have a misconception about identity crisis being relevant only in adolescent years. However, that is not true. There are several instances of resurgence of identity crisis in adulthood. As earlier mentioned, because of the lack of understanding between the relation of the resolution of identity crisis and the degree of adjustment, the individual emerges with a sense of identity diffusion rather than a personal strong identity. I am not saying this is the case with everyone, but most people do end up with such a situation. This causes crisis in adulthood. The main reason for these crises are changes in life, wanting a change in lifestyle, a change in ideologies, a change of location, probably even occupation, or just boredom from the monotonous life. This is also commonly known as the midlife crisis, or popularly known as the midlife crisis. The study also talks about the difference in the nature of the crisis that men and women face. In adolescence, men face a different kind of crisis, identity crisis, than women face, which forms a basis for them to have a resurgence of identity crisis in the future because of the non-understanding or non-similarity in the crisis of the two sexes. The picture depicts the way the man sees the world and the woman sees the world and how it's different. Evaluation of evidence. I have arranged my sources in a flow of the formation of identity through life. It starts from adolescence, where identity crisis first occurs, and around the age of 18, when we are entering into adulthood, it begins to resolve and a basis of an identity is beginning to form. However, in some cases, due to the lack or lousy understanding of the degree of adjustment in relation to resolution of identity crisis, it results in temporary regression instead of permanent resolution of the identity crisis, which eventually leads to resurgence of identity crisis in adulthood, thus proving that the formation of identity does not only take place in adolescence, but is a complex psychological process that we individuals face throughout our lifetime. I am 18. A year back, I wasn't the person I am today. Within a year, I have changed massively. And I completely agree with Eric Erickson when he says that identity crisis begins to resolve and you start forming an identity once you reach the age of 18. Because I myself have experienced it. I myself believe that I have a new identity today that I did not have in the past. I know who I am. I know what I need to do. I know what is expected of me. I know myself as a part of society today. However, I believe that in the next 10 years, I won't be able to recognize this version of myself at all. I'll probably have an identity crisis in the course of the next 10 years as well. So even though I do agree with Eric Erickson on the fact that, yes, identity crisis does get resolved by the age of 18, I still believe that it is not completely formed or is not the final version of your identity that is formed by the age of 18. That an identity does not have a final version. It keeps on changing through time as your surroundings change, as your situation changes, as time changes. Thank you.